Well, hello everyone.
Wow.
I remember starting the day all together this morning. I don't know how many of you were around at that time. And this is towards the end of the day. I was just saying to Janet, we were a bit too ambitious. We put so many things in just one day, such a long day, such a loaded day. But the best for the last, I would say. Janet is with us. I'm not going to take time to really introduce for a long introduction for Janet. And I'm so curious about to hear from Janet um, those courageous conversations. Um, you say in your introduction how we can address broken systems, and not necessarily in the coachee, but also in ourselves. And you leave us with a hint. I don't know what's that, how to do it. So we are all with you, and the floor is yours, Janet. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the welcome, Risa, and the introduction, and welcome to all of you. It's a delight to be here. I was just reminiscing with Sarah the last time I was physically present in the EMCC community. I've been virtually, but physically present, and it was in Bilbao. So maybe some of you will remember having been at that conference. And 10 years ago, it feels like time flies. Quite amazing. And I do believe as coaches that we live in a borderless community. We speak the same language every place on the planet. And it just fills my heart with gratitude that we are able to be in each other's company as fellow learners and servants really into the world of humanity. I hold coaching in that way. So a little bit of insight to the bias that I carry that we'll explore a bit today. A couple of housekeeping things for you. One of the things that I experience when I'm in conference, particularly after 2 days worth of content you all have done, you're sitting pretty full up to your chin with information and experiences already. And it's really easy to lose sight of a question or a comment that occurs to you as we're navigating the next 45 or 50 minutes or so. So please don't sit on it. If something comes to mind, if you have an insight that emerges or a reaction that surfaces, use the chat pod liberally for that purpose. I'm very comfortable keeping an eye over there and I'll weave things in. I'm also going to stop a couple of times and simply check in and say, take a moment to ask yourself, what am I experiencing right now? What's landing for me? Where am I lost? What's going on here? What did that mean? Be in the experience of our engagement together as fully as you can, given how much you've already done today. And of course, it's all being recorded, so you'll be able to come back to it at a later time if I've said something. Don't try to take notes as a result, because the recording is there. All right, let's see. I want to make sure I've done all of the required housekeeping. It looks like it. All right, I'm going to go back to the slides. Risa, you indicated that I had given you a hint. I think that's quite fascinating. Um, I will confess that after I brainstormed this particular subject for you all for reimagining the future, I looked at it a few weeks later and thought, wow, did I really decide that that's what we wanted to talk about? And of course, we could go in many, many different doorways when we think about what condones oppression. Sadly, in my mind, the reason I picked this topic for redesigning the future is I think the world is woefully out of balance. That because we, as coaches, have the capacity through the relationships that we have, whether we're coaches or mentors or supervisors, it doesn't matter. We have such a sacred trust in those dialogues. I think that we are in a unique position to prevent business as usual. Some of you will remember Sir John Whitmore. Maybe were around when he was railing for all of us about where were we when the titans of finance were being dishonest is a kind way all the way to corrupt on the other end of the spectrum. Where were we in noticing and in thinking about what was being given priority? What were we making more important? And I had a long conversation with him at a conference in Turkey about that time. It was with a bunch of financial leaders, which kind of cracked me up. And I come from financial services. So I was sitting in the conversation feeling, oh my gosh, I'm one of those he's talking about. Because I worked in that market. And he was so right. I knew exactly what was going on. I was doing my best to resource and to provide opportunity for those leaders to stay true to their own integrity. But I never asked the question, and why are you letting it happen? If you see what's going on, why aren't you stepping in? And so I think that's our question too. The world is at a moment, some have been calling it an inflection point, that gives us permission to let go of the familiar and the comfortable. That's going to be an inside job. So I gave this particular title to say, where do we silence our own voices? Where are we tolerating the silence of others in the name of what we think our duty is, rather than being faithful to the relationship of our work, which is to not condone oppression, but to create inclusion and to create emergent conversation. So I will leave it there as an introductory remark. I want to show you a quick video that is the trailer on the book, that I think it's in my voice, and I want you to hear how 2020 impacted me. I never intended to write a book. It was not on my bucket list of the things I ought to do as a professional, but I was invited by my team to do it, maybe a little more like demanded. And it ended up being an incredibly profound experience for me to recognize all the places I was condoning silence. So it's just a minute or so. There you go.
There is no return to normal, the way things were before 2020. In a world on fire, flooding, and in pandemic, 2020 is the year from where we may only go forward. Uncertainty about what's on the other side of things that are familiar to us is what stops most of us from taking new actions and unable to choose a meaningful path forward. Do you see 2020 as a lesson or an invitation? This is an invitation to intentionally invite change. It is a time to step up, to lead authentically. Labeling change as the enemy will keep us imprisoned, forgetting that the world is constantly changing around us. Take the first step and get some guidance from reading this new book, Invite Change. There is...
All right, I didn't show it to you to buy the book because you already have that opportunity available to you. But I wanted to give you a sense that when we lift our heads up from our history and our comfortable place of contribution and our confidence in the craft that we have, we recognize that there are influences on us. So the supervisors in the room, if you're thinking about David Clutterbuck and Peter Hawkins' seven-eyed model, the influences of the seventh eye today are intense and intensifying. As we are exploring with clients and asking questions such as, how does race show up in the workplace for you? If I'm speaking with someone who is of a culture or a race or an orientation of any kind in their identity that is different from mine, and I don't ask that question, I am condoning. If I'm not available to be uncomfortable with what it is that is emerging for them as it becomes opened for people to say, I don't feel good about what's going on here, then I'm essentially contributing to their long history of feeling excluded or compromised or marginalized in some way. And so I think we have to up our game as practitioners and begin to find our own internal place. That, we talk about being comfortable with intense emotion. This is another level of it. And I think it's a fabulous opportunity. So our GPS heading for today, why pursue courageous conversations? I want to give you a little bit of context about the consequence of not pursuing it, and perhaps inspire you to be courageous in your own heart. So then I'll talk a little bit about what is courageous conversation. I'm going to give you 3 simple guidelines to get started with, and a way that I've been exploring this myself over the last 5 or 6 years. And then how do we do it? What's the first step? And I will, I guess spoiler alert, it starts with you. So allow this conversation that I'm entering into with you as a courageous one to allow something new to emerge that's mutual learning. That's a little clue. Allow this time to be for you. If you've got a piece of paper, jot what's happening internally. Don't write my words down. Write down the words that your inner observer picks up. Maybe you do it in your phone or your iPad, that's fine too. But allow this to penetrate you at the level that says, wow, I don't spend time thinking about that. I'm not aware of my own edges of habit and preference and assumption that are keeping me from seeing the world as it actually is. I was really privileged in 2020 to spend some time with Margaret Wheatley. Some of you may know her from her leadership work. She has, in the last 5 years, engaged in some work with Chupa Trunga, which is the Shambhala, the sacred path of the warrior. Maybe just show me by way of hands how many of you are familiar with that work. Have any of you investigated that? Oh, I'm not seeing any hands. Oh, good. Something new. Shambhala, the sacred path of the warrior. And what's interesting to me about that body of work is that it really helps us to recognize the places in our lives where we have blank spaces. I'm using that purposely instead of blind spot. Those of you that have got years and years of personality work, that's a hard habit to break. But if you think about it, just simply, blind spot is a fairly prejudicial phrase to make about anyone who has compromised vision. Blank space is a much more descriptive way of appreciating that we have a canvas of our lives fully painted, and then there are places where there isn't any paint, and we realize, you know what, I have no experience with that. I have no mental model. I have no construct. I can't embrace it. It doesn't have meaning for me. And these are the recognitions that are important to have a courageous conversation. The fact that it's blank to you doesn't mean it isn't blank for someone else. It means that you're being the recipient of something that could be quite enlivening for you if you'll allow it. Now, that's the high side, of course. The negative side is the reason I use this image. You might recognize this as the graphic from the inside of the ship, the Titanic. So as a metaphor, what happened on the Titanic? A brilliant engineer did something that had never been done before, and over time became completely oppressed by money and greed. The owners of the ship were really clear what they wanted. They wanted more people on the ship than it could hold, and they wanted to be able to go faster than a ship had ever gone before. So the achievements and goals were far superior, overriding what was actually far more important, which was the safety of the ship in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the ocean. And we all know the tragic loss of life that came as a result. Not just the fact that the ship couldn't do what they were trying to make it do and nobody would listen, but think about all the people that were left under deck, who were not allowed out, who were locked in because others had privilege and the right to get to the boats and to get off the ship. So, yes, it's a movie and a story, but it's a story of a human condition that is not very flattering to any of us, a more than, less than way of holding the world. And as long as we're in that duality, we have a very difficult time bridging to each other instead of breaking apart and standing in positions. The consequences are great. Each of you, I'm sure, have had clients that you've begun to see this with. And I think that Arundhati Roy is a wonderful activist and author and advocate for humanity. And I was reading her article in The Guardian. I know many of you live in England, so maybe you've picked this up. This is the backdrop quote, and the reason I included it. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one's no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, I love this line, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and our hatred, smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly and with little luggage to imagine another world and be ready to fight for it. This notion that we need to bring everything with us, that the rear view mirror of our life experience and our expertise is what is most important to lean into, might just be a faulty premise. What if we were to say, yes, I have that, and what's new in the context I find myself now? You, of course, do this all day long with your clients, and yet organizations listen to the words, but are not changing their actions quite as easily. In her article in The Guardian, she was talking about her prime minister in India, and I'm going to read what he wrote. He spoke at the World Economic Forum in January of this year. So remember where you are in Europe in January with the second wave of the pandemic. Friends, it would not be advisable to judge India's success with that of another country. In a country which is home to 18% of the world population, that country has saved humanity from a big disaster by containing corona effectively. She wrote the article to say, how many of us have stayed silent in the face of a leader who is not telling the truth? And we condone the liar in our silence at great consequence. All right, this is huge consequence, right? The death and suffering that is happening in India is inexcusable. Let's bring it back down to something more personal. What happened for each of you during the pandemic? What was disrupted in your own value system, in your belief system, in your sense of what was flow and ease and grace for you in your life? What was it that you noticed was erupting and no longer actually fully part of your preferred enlivened experience? What I noticed for myself was the tension inside of me about being well in myself, being whole in myself through my work was completely inadequate. That the depth of feeling I had, empathy and compassion for the pain that people were suffering. I didn't suffer. I didn't get sick. My family didn't get sick. Nobody in my company got sick. I kiss the ground every day that happened. But that's not so for my human family. All over this world, there has been loss, which means all of us are grieving. And ultimately, we'll pass through this. But what's on the other side? What do we choose to access on the other side of that disruption? And for me, it's the innate creative life force. That never goes away. In some ways, one could call the pandemic its own creative life force, right? It's the disease creating its own pathway. So what are we going to pay attention to? Will we pay attention to the mitigation of the suffering alone? Or will we pay attention to, with a little wider camera lens, what's actually stimulating the reason the pandemic came in the first place? What are the systems that are holding in place this more than, less than thinking, that somebody has to be better off and therefore someone has to be less off? You know, capitalism is often pointed to as the reason we have such difficulty, and yet Plutarch in the 1st century AD basically said, you know, the great illness we have is this notion of people who are rich and people who are poor. That wasn't about money. That was about soul and spirit. Who is the being? How are they living? How are they contributing into community? And we've turned everything into achievement and lost connection to what makes us a human society that's thriving. Again, as practitioners, you know that we're working with the whole of the person. So why would we exclude the conversation about these things that create internal tension? That is a form of condoning, tolerating through silence. This is a wonderful author. As a white woman who grew up in the middle of the United States, St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis was an interesting town in terms of race relations. We have St. Louis and East St. Louis, which is white, and the other East St. Louis is black for the most part. I grew up in the middle of that split, so I have that in my history, and of course, I also have privilege in my history. I cannot be a spokesperson for the suffering, but I can be a witness. And so my journey has been about learning through the eyes of others who have witnessed the oppression firsthand and begin to give us all, in my mind, a voice of clarity. Being able as a Shambhala warrior to see the world as it is, not as I want it to be, but truly as it is. So Ijola Oulu is really talking in her work about deeper levels of listening. When we identify where our privilege intersects with someone else's oppression, we'll find opportunities to make real change. Maybe stop for a moment and say, what's the question you would ask? What would you invite your clients to consider about the intersection in their lives? Whether they're on the privilege side of the intersection or they're on the oppression side of the intersection, they're in the intersection. Which means if we're looking at the whole of what is happening, what is actually happening, not what we want to be happening, now we have a possibility to see what's at the root, not just the symptom of the pain. If we refuse to listen to someone's cries for justice and equality until the request comes in language you feel comfortable with, that's a way of asserting dominance over them in that situation. So much of work that's been happening for the last 2 decades in the diversity and inclusion and then equity and now justice, and ultimately to me beyond DEI into belonging, which is the DNA impulse of the human species. All of this has been about trying to replace discomfort with comfort. What if discomfort wasn't the enemy? What if discomfort is the answer? What if everything we want lives outside of what's comfortable and familiar? Because what we want is to evolve and to grow and to strengthen love in humanity. So I'm building the case for you. What will you be inspired enough about to create in your relations in your life that it will overcome the doubt that it has to be comfortable? Because it won't be. Malala Yousafzai, you might know this young woman. She's really quite extraordinary. She was, I think she actually might be the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner. She is Pakistani in origin. She was 14 years old when she won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was for her work in education. But not just the way you normally think about access to education or the quality of education. She was actually concerned about the fact that young girls were bullied. Young girls were spit on. They were fought with. They were diminished in ways that meant that ultimately they would never be able to live an independent life. There will be, according to UNESCO, 140 million girls under the age of 18 married. They will be married off because their families can't support them. They will therefore not finish their education. Therefore, they will not learn to read and write. Therefore, they will never be able to function without having someone to provide for them, which is why they end up married and actually with many children, often in circumstances that require many children because they die out of inadequate provision of food and clean water. Now, what did I do there? In 60 seconds, I gave you a worldview of have and have not. So much of the world never worries about these things. And yet, her voice is what's made the difference. So this is a big key. Where are you bringing a voice to where there is oppression? Stepping in, pointing it out. I love this woman. Perhaps some of you have seen some of her YouTube. She's also a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Lema Bowie is actually from Liberia. And you all will remember there was a very brutal civil war there. We've seen many documentaries about the youth soldiers that were conscripted into that war. And she was the brave voice that stood up and said, "Not on my watch." They were the white t-shirt brigade. They were the ones who kept fighting for there to be peace talks. And if it had not been for her and her inspiration and her unwillingness, her unabiding faith and integrity and truth, that war would have ended with the annihilation of the people in Liberia. They were on that pathway. As a result of those peace talks, she also, and the women in Liberia, because of course the men were dead, they lost close to 70% of their male population. They're rebuilding. This has happened in history throughout time. When are we going to stop tolerating this level of violence amongst each other? So let me pause there and feel free to read this slide. This is what is a courageous conversation. I've purposely asked you to examine where is your relationship to violence when you see it? Maybe not on such a grand scale as these amazing women have been navigating, but more personally in your own life, in your way of walking with your clients. What are you noticing with them? What are they avoiding talking about? Where might they be wondering, is it okay for me to feel what I'm feeling, to talk about these things, to find my own voice, to say not on my watch? Is it okay when they are with you to do that? So I'm going to stop the share for a moment so I can open up the chat pod for myself and see what we might want to weave in. Yes. Not only Margaret's work on turning to one another, but her last book, which is Who Do We Choose to Be? It's a really profound invitation to examine for each of us what my value system around generosity. It's a huge high value for me. I've realized that I've had privilege to be generous. And I met a young woman at an organization I support here in the US to prevent human trafficking, actually to eradicate human trafficking. And one of the survivors was standing at the podium, and I felt duly chastised. It was right. It was right what she was saying. And she articulated that she does not want money. She does not want pity. She does not want to be taken care of. She said, what I want is a job. I want to be seen for my capability. I want to be supported to get access to opportunity for me to bring my human life force to something useful. Because this situation happened doesn't make me less a person. People want dignity. If we see the world as it is, not as we want it to be, we'll see gentleness. We'll see bravery. We'll see decency. We'll see dignity. We have to see. We cannot unsee what's happened in the world this year. I don't care where you are in the world. We have not been very kind to each other as human beings. And again, I think we have a unique opportunity as coaches and mentors and coaching supervisors to call the conversation, to give people a space to know it's okay to be upset and angry and frustrated and annoyed and in grief and maybe in shame. And it's not all of who you are. You are so much more than that. So when we talk about courageous conversations, what we're really saying is there is a space from the heart, not the head, where we allow for views to be openly shared, the real truth, the brutal truth, and that through that exchange, something emerges that is a new shared understanding. Now, as I said earlier, there is no way that happens if I can't get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I must be able to have somebody say something that really totally rocks my world. I had no idea that that's how that person saw it. And then to stay with it, to be immersed in that experience. When we're working in supervision, we're always looking at what is the field telling us? What is the emergent energy and emotion and sensation? We use the body and the breath to help us to begin to get a sense of something larger at work. Courageous conversations includes this. Being able to recognize we've just heard something disturbing, disruptive to our habit and preference and assumptions, and to allow ourselves to relax into a state of wonder, beyond curiosity, a state of wonder. I wonder from where within this person's life experience, from their worldview, the values and beliefs that they carry, how is it that they see the world that way? Many of you know, of course, we have a great division going on here in the United States, and I have many, many friends and colleagues who are on one side or the other and have refused to have a conversation. And it doesn't matter either side. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy to completely deconstruct the systems. I would say we need to examine those systems and loosen our grip a bit to see what we would reimagine the future differently. But by golly, we're not going to get there if we can't sit down and have a conversation. So again, we have the privilege to do that. We create the safe place for an immersive experience that compels relationship. Thoughtful, respectful, productive dialogue. So I'm going to give you a little practice that I do every year. Every year I pick a word. And I pick the word because it carries the energy of change that is interesting to me, something I'm seeking or longing for in my life that would make my life more robust, more satisfying. And then I turn each of the letters of that word into a bit of a mantra or affirmation or intention, whatever you like to work with in your own system. So I'm going to give you what mine is. And it's simply an invitation for you to consider this as an opportunity to attune your own being to the change you want to be in the world, just to steal a little line from Gandhi. So here you go. My word in 2021 is alchemy. And the A stands for aspiring toward my vision. And the L stands for learning, stumbling forward. The C stands for connect with my global tribe. The H is to hold my heart's desire in tender love. The E is to engage in full expression of my potency. And I'm missing a letter because I'm trying to look at you. There we go. M is magnify strengths and optimism. And Y is yes to life on my terms. In other words, those set of intention statements for me is how I get attuned to having the courage necessary to make the relationship with life more important than whether I'm okay. That's a small self in me that is afraid I might offend someone. I must learn how to say, I truly want to know, and I may not do this well. I might make a mistake. And if I've said something offensive, I want to know that too, because if you don't tell me, if you tolerate it in silence, you've condoned my being your oppressor, and I don't want to be that. So in really simple terms, personalize this for yourself. How do you have a conversation with yourself that allows you to express your views openly and truthfully? What will be emergent for you? If you let go of your grip on your comfortable habits and preferences, and you find the places where you can immerse into a dialogue that starts to build a new imagination of the future. Yes, Pedro. So alchemy is the word, which is ALCHEMY. Yes, alchemist of the new future. I think so too. I'll put it in the chat at the very end, the whole piece that I gave you. But find your word and have some fun with that. So how do we deliver courageous conversations? You know, this is a beautiful golden bridge. It's in Vietnam, and it sits 140 meters above a forest that's in the Turan Son Mountains. And it's actually two hands. I couldn't get the image to be big enough for you with both of them, but imagine two hands, which they've allowed to age. You can see the earth is absorbing them. But metaphorically, part of what we need to do to deliver a courageous conversation is to push our chairs back, supervisors, a couple of inches. You know, mentors, we take the coach and we say, stand up on the balcony with me and let's look at this session you've just had. As a coach, we ask our clients to get a little perspective. Let's go walk outside. These are all ways in which we set the stage for a conversation about something other than what they're experiencing. Of course, being able to create the conditions of confidentiality are really important. You know, one of the things that I think is kind of fascinating about organizational life is that we know from all of the research, all of you who are social psychologists or maybe industrial and organizational psychologists, you know that the dynamics of the relationships in the organization are the reason organizations underperform. The dynamics of the relationships. Now, the other side is true too. Amy Edmondson's work out of Harvard and Stanford. She's been writing about psychological safety and the fearless organization. And what do we say? Google did the research. Project Aristotle reports the number one factor for a high-performing team is psychological safety. Okay, we know those two things. What are we doing about it? We talk about psychological safety, but leaders aren't trained to step in when they are seeing an absence of psychological safety. They speak about it, but they're not engaging in an immersive experience. We also recognize when there are dynamics. Gosh, they come to sessions all the time and they talk about the dynamics and what am I going to do and how am I going to intervene? Yeah, that's right. What were the conditions you created that has those dynamics be there in the first place? That's the difference between coaching the symptom and coaching the roots. So how do we deliver courageous conversation? We stop problem solving and instead we create the space to get a little perspective about how each of us has agency. We are part cause or reason for the fact that the breakdown in dynamics is happening in the first place. Now, I also happen to think that it is the youth that are our future. That's always been true. I know it sounds like a cliche. Gracia Michelle is one of these people. Actually, she's been, I think she might be a dom now. That Queen Elizabeth might have given her that credit. But she's really talking about the importance of changing the mindset of youth today, which, oh, by the way, means changing the mindset of the teachers and the administrators and the parents. It's the whole system of how do we evolve as a human society. Of course, this is something all of us are involved in. I want to show you what the impact of bullying is really all about.
Just making sure you're up. 5 more minutes. Becca, let's go. Say cheese.
That was Seiji. Oh my god. Oh my
god. Amanda, stop. She's done nothing to you. Get out of here. Go. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Here's the key about bullying. 1 in 5 every day experiences bullying. 1 in 6 in cyberspace. It's most prevalent in middle school, 6th grade. Do you remember being in the 6th grade? I do. It was not very much fun, that's for sure. So then the question is, what's the consequence of that? Underperforming academically. Dropout rates, bullying, results in alcoholism, smoking cigarettes, smoking cannabis, fighting, and ultimately, sticks and stones will break my bones. They do actually end up breaking bones. So why does that happen? 70% of teachers say they see it. They see it happening. The most effective intervention is with their friends, not with adults. But if an adult won't do it, why would the friends do it? So you see, it's a very interconnected system. Now, I wanted to introduce you to something to do a little bit of investigation in, if you're interested in looking at this question about the youth, is something called Loving Classroom. David Geffen is the genius behind this. They're doing amazing work in South Africa, and that's the data that you're looking at. The introduction of the 8 virtues. What do we do in coaching? We examine values. We ask people to look inside and remember who they are, the wholeness of what it is to be a human. Respect, compassion, listening, kindness, gratitude, love, friendship, care. Teaching 6th and 7th graders these virtues and how to change the conversation they have with each other. This is an example of courageous conversations being instilled in the youth. They taught the teachers in the school, they taught all the administrators in the school, they taught the parents of the students these 8 virtues. And this is the data that comes back. I'd say that's incredible. It's fast, it's quick, and it's sustaining. They now have grants coming in from the World Bank and UNESCO to do this in 12 countries in Africa. But by golly, we need to be doing it in every country in the world because the youth is the future. Nelson Mandela said one of the most difficult things to do is not to change society, but to change yourself. And this really was my intent, was to provide you with an opportunity to think about this. What is it that must arise within us as practitioners to have courageous conversations with our clients in any form and shape they take, with ourselves, with our families, with our communities? If we're going to reimagine the future, let's do it from the roots of what is a loving, kind humanity. And so I'll leave you with a little inspiration, and then we'll take any remaining questions. Are you seeing this? Thumbs up? Yes. So thank you, everybody. That's all I have for you today. If there's some questions you want to ask, we do have a few minutes. I'm happy to entertain that, or a comment you want to make. And if you would use the raise your hand function, and somebody can take me off spotlight, I'm happy to open it up for us to have a conversation.
Great, such inspiring and enriching conversation. Thank you, Janet. Thank you for being with us and for all your contributions. So I think that concludes our second day, and I will be looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow at the closing and the third day of our conference. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.